quickly, and then we'll get the other one up, and we'll get on to here. Jessica, lovely. Okay, let me introduce you. But I wanted to just point out before we got there that there's something very interesting that I was pulling out at the end, is that whilst we've seen the danger of certainty, we've also seen two kinds of certainty today, the certainty of death and the certainty of joy. That's really interesting. It's what we do with it that matters now. Right, so let me introduce Jessica Fulton Lee. Jessica is a priest in the Anglican Church of North America and lives in Virginia Beach with her husband, Evan Lee, who is already a superstar in our midst. Jessica is an associate pastor at Beach Church, which is a great name for a church, sorry to interject, and a doctoral student in Northwind Theological Seminary's Romantic Theology program, where she is working on the completion of her treatise. Jessica and Evan serve on mission to their local animal rescue community and have a creative and adult daughter, 2 beloved dogs, and a cherished cat. Ladies and gentlemen, Jessica Fulton Lee.
Hi, guys. So today I'm going to be presenting on this paper called Becoming a Eucatastrophe, Helm, Hammerhand, Théoden, and the Translation of Northern Courage to Eucatastrophe. We are all very familiar at this point with where the phrase joy beyond the walls of the world comes from. It comes from that beautiful essay on fairy stories where Tolkien is defining what a eucatastrophe is. It is the sudden, joyous turn, a sudden and miraculous grace. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal and final defeat, and is insofar evangelum, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And it is the eucatastrophe that is the conduit for this joy that is beyond the walls of the world. Now, Tolkien's works have a lot of eucatastrophes in them, but my favorite is the moment where King Théoden arrives on the Pelennor fields. And it is a scene that needs a eucatastrophe. The Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King, has stepped into the city of Minas Tirith, under the archway that no enemy had yet passed. He has this epic face down with Gandalf, and then out of nowhere, a cock crows. And it is answered by horns, 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 and dark Mendelloan sides they dimly echoed, great horns of the north wildly blowing. Rohan had come at last. Of course, I'm not alone in loving this scene. Tolkien himself says, I am most stirred by the sounds of the horns of the Rohirrim at cockcrow. But what is behind this eucatastrophe? Théoden himself really is the eucatastrophe in this scene. His arrival is the eucatastrophic event. But how? And how can we be like King Théoden to a world that is besieged in darkness? This study is actually part of a larger study that I am doing for my doctoral treatise on Tolkien's genealogies. And I know, biblical genealogies are where year-long Bible studies go to die. Tolkien's genealogies are the reason most of us could not read through the appendices the first time. But they're actually fascinating. This comes to us from Lord of the Rings, and it's Tolkien talking about the hobbits. He says, they drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom and in what degree. Now, we know that Tolkien considered himself a little bit of a hobbit. And he spent a lot of time working on the genealogy of his characters. So much time that I argue that his genealogies are an important subgenre of Tolkien studies. So just as we study Tolkien's poems as a subgenre within the legendarium, we can actually study his construction of genealogies as a genre within the legendarium. Because they're an aspect of his myth that can convey meaning. And not just any meaning, but theological meaning. Tolkien uses his genealogies to create characters that are symbolic images. Now, that's symbolic images. I would never accuse him of allegory unless we're talking about Leaf by Niggle, and we all know that's his dirty secret, but most of the time I'm not going to accuse him of allegory. But he uses genealogy to create characters that embody larger concepts. And it's an important distinction. He uses genealogy to connect characters in really meaningful ways. Characters like Aragorn and Arwen, who you see in the picture there, because nothing is hotter in Middle-earth than being distantly related. Okay? So remember that. His genealogies are really the landscape for his character development. Just as his physical landscapes are important to understanding the story, the genealogy of his characters is really important for us to understand who they are and how they function. So we often encourage new readers to read with a map, right? I would encourage readers to also read with a character's genealogy in their hands, because it's really important. Because if we don't orient ourselves to a character's genealogy, we might miss the bigger story. Because Tolkien creates meta myths and even meta characters by using genealogies. So meta myths, one character's story may only be part of a larger story that extends in their entire family line. And certain family lineages have personalities of their own, almost like they are one big character. So, just as a landscape has important features like peninsulas or islands or something like that, Tolkien's genealogies actually have important features to them as well. And the feature that is most important to the story of King Théoden is actually what I'm calling the Uncle of Renown device. What is an Uncle of Renown? I'm glad you asked. I haven't published the paper yet, so you don't know what it is. An Uncle of Renown is a celebrated male ancestor with an ancillary relationship to a developing character. It's an ancestral uncle who is celebrated. So usually this celebrated uncle has no children or no surviving children, or at least the story doesn't follow their children. So they have an offset relationship to a developing character. Now, the Uncle of Renown represents the potential of a developing character. Because they have an uncle relationship to a character, their renown is a potential that a character may or may not live into. That is a little bit different from an expected renown. When we look at Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and look at his genealogy, which is the most excellent genealogy in the entire Legendarium, we expect him to be hot stuff. Like, if he is not awesome, we're going to be crestfallen. But if you look at a character like Bilbo Baggins, well, he does have this great uncle, and Bulroar Bandabras Took is one of our uncles of renown. And he is the uncle of renown not only for Bilbo, but also notably for Pippin. He also occupies that place for Frodo and Merry, but Tolkien doesn't make as much use of that device with those characters. And the thrust of it is Bandabras Bulroar Took was an awesome hobbit that went lopping off goblin heads and inventing the game of Goth, and he was great. But what about these guys? So this comes to us from The Hobbit. Bilbo says, I had a great grand uncle once, Bulroar Took, asserts Bilbo to very doubtful dwarves. And yes, but that was a long time ago, said Glóin. I was talking about you. Yes, your ancestral uncle was great, but how about you? And that is really the thrust of an uncle of renown. Now, along with your uncles of renown, you also have what I call your uncles of infamy. They also represent a potential, but it's a dark and tragic potential, which I could really summarize by just saying Fëanor. Fëanor is Galadriel's literal uncle. He also serves as this uncle of infamy for the entire fairy tale lineage, or the entire half-elven lineage. So why is this device important in the story of King Théoden? Well, King Théoden has an uncle of renown, and that is Helm Hammerhand. And maybe even more importantly, Théoden is going to become an uncle of renown during the course of The Lord of the Rings, so that we see a legend as it's being made. So, let's look at a little genealogy here. You are looking at a simplified version of the Rohirric royal lineage. These are the 3 houses of the Rohirric kings, starting with none other than Eorl the Young. Now, he is the eponymous ancestor of the Rohirric kings. Remember, the Rohirrim call themselves the Eorlingas, and they do that because of Eorl the Young. Now, Eorl has a son named Brego, and Brego has 3 sons, Baldur, Aldor, and Eofor. Baldur decides to take the paths of the dead. He makes a brief cameo appearance in Return of the King. His skeletal remains do, anyhow. But he's obviously not continuing on the family line. So Aldor, who lives so long, he becomes known as Aldor the Old, becomes the king. And he is actually the direct ancestor of Helm Hammerhand, okay? Now, Eofor's going to go off and become a noble and have kids as well. But Helm Hammerhand, as we know, has sons, but those sons die in the conflict with Wulf. And so when Helm Hammerhand dies, his crown is actually going to go to his sister's son, Freyolf. And so Freyolf's going to start the new line. Freyolf is actually the direct ancestor of King Théoden. Now, we know that Théoden has one son, Theodred, and Theodred dies at the Battle of the Isen. So that when Théoden himself dies, his crown's going to pass to his sister's son, who is Éomer. Éomer is kind of cool because not only is his mother, Theodwen, Théoden's sister, but his father, Éomund, is actually in direct descent from Eofor. So that Éomer is actually descended from both of the lines of the surviving sons of Brego. So Éomer is Eorl squared. I call this fraternal convergence. Tolkien likes to intermarry lines of brothers back into each other. Again, distantly related, very attractive in Middle-earth. But this really fits, this renewed Eorlness really fits with our themes of renewal in the early Fourth Age. So that is significant for Éomer. So looking at this genealogy, we have characters that are naturally talking to each other. We have Eorl the Young, who founded Rohan. We have Freyolf, who is going to renew and restore Rohan after a time of conflict. And we're going to have Éomer, who's going to do the same thing. Those guys are talking to each other. They're our founders and renewers. But we also have Helm Hammerhand and Théoden, who are the end of their lines, who are also in a very similar place. And what we're going to find is these guys are setting the bar for the next line of kings. They're going to be the celebrated ends of their own lines who are going to tell the next line of kings what the standard of excellence really is. So let's talk a little bit more about Helm Hammerhand. Helm Hammerhand is a very celebrated king. In the appendices, we read that of the kings of the Mark between Eorl and Théoden, most is said of Helm Hammerhand. Uncle of renown indeed. You might have seen the movie War of the Rohirrim that came out recently. I liked it. We can talk about that later. But even in the appendices, Helm is a celebrated person. And really, Helm Hammerhand is going to epitomize what we've already talked a little bit about. He's going to epitomize the Anglo-Saxon heroic spirit, what Tolkien would call northern courage. Helm Hammerhand exemplifies the indomitable Rohirric spirit. And his story is going to be very similar to how Tolkien describes the pre-Beowulf hero stories, in which we see the exaltation of the undefeated will in a world beneath the sky's inaccessible roof, whereon, as in a little circle of light about their halls, men with courage as their stay went forward to that battle with the hostile world and the offspring of dark, which ends for all, even kings and champions, in defeat. And this is really the story of Helm Hammerhand. This is northern courage. This is courage in the face of certain death. Now, let's look at a little bit about Helm Hammerhand's story, though. Helm Hammerhand's going to rebuff the schemes of a pompous usurper named Freka. He takes him out with one punch, actually. Freka attempts to usurp the throne by forming an unholy alliance, by trying to marry their children together. And Helm isn't having any of that. But Freka, trying to imply to Helm that Helm needs him in order to be secure, says, "Old kings that refuse a proffered staff may fall on their knees." To which Helm says, "If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust on him, he breaks it." One punch, Freka's done. But unfortunately, Wolf isn't done. So Helm Hammerhand is driven into the Hornberg and the ravine behind, which is afterwards known as Helm's Deep, by Freka's son, Wolf, during a particularly bitter winter. He's backed in a corner, but Helm Hammerhand is not done yet. He's going to personally terrify Wolf's army, stalking them like a snow troll, before dying frozen on his feet, and I quote, "His knees were unbent." Even in death, this man is indomitable, uncompromising, and heroic. And he is King Théoden's uncle of renown. This is the potential that King Théoden has. It is not the potential that he is living into, though, at the beginning of the Two Towers. In fact, we see Théoden at the beginning of the story very dependent upon a crooked staff. And that crooked staff is, of course, Grima Wormtongue, who is spouting the lies of Saruman. And really what Wormtongue is doing is encouraging King Théoden to be safe, encouraging him to be comfortable, encouraging him to be paranoid, and this is all ultimately leading to Théoden being senile. How insidious is this? What makes the Rohirrim threatening is this indomitable northern spirit, and this attack is meant by Saruman and Grima to undermine this northern spirit, this courage. This is a spiritual and a psychological attack. Gandalf says, "Ever Wormtongue's whispering was in your ears, poisoning your thought, chilling your heart, weakening your limbs, while others watched and could do nothing, for your will was in his keeping." This is a much more insidious attack than that of Wolf. But thankfully, Théoden allows himself to be encouraged out of this place, and he symbolizes his turn by casting down a staff, a literal staff that he's been leaning on, a literal staff that has great symbolic value. Gandalf says, "Cast aside your prop," and from the king's hand the black staff fell clattering on the stones. He drew himself up slowly, as a man that is stiff from long bending over some dull toil. It is here that Théoden begins to regain the northern courage of his people. He does so also with this statement, which is my favorite line probably in the entire Legendarium. Théoden says, "I myself will go to war, to fall in the front of battle if it must be. Thus shall I sleep better." This is the resolve of Helm Hammerhand. But this resolve is going to be tested, and none other than Helm's Deep. So Théoden also finds himself in a tough place, meeting the challenge of Helm Hammerhand in the same place that Helm Hammerhand met it. And Théoden has to do this without the encouragement of Gandalf, or even the false prop of Wormtongue. Théoden has to learn to stand on his own 2 feet, like Helm Hammerhand, and regain the spirit of his people. Now, fortunately, he does do this. And we've already heard this read, but it's worth reading again. Things get really dark, and death seems imminent, and Théoden says, the end will not be long, but I will not end here, taken like an old badger in a trap. When dawn comes, I will bid men to sound Helm's horn, and I will ride forth. I might have to die, but I'm not dying like a punk. I'm going to meet death head on. This is northern courage. This is Théoden stepping into the heritage of Helm Hammerhand. And when they sound that horn, man, it is so beautiful that Théoden's men think Helm has shown up to aid King Théoden. "Helm, Helm," the rider shouted. "Helm is arisen and comes back to war. Helm for Théoden king. Now, fortunately, although Théoden is willing to die and is willing to face death, he has his own eucatastrophe, and Gandalf and Erkenbrand actually show up to the aid of Rohan. This is really significant because Erkenbrand actually shows up on foot. And how unusual, because the Rohirrim are usually mounted warriors. But you know who else died on their feet? Is Helm Hammerhand. And we already know that Théoden has described Erkenbrand as being a man of valor. In him lived again the valor of Helm Hammerhand. He is already a man that is very like Helm Hammerhand. The end result is it is like Helm Hammerhand himself shows up to Helm's Deep to aid King Théoden in regaining his northern courage. But Théoden still has to break the staff. Théoden still has to defeat his foe. And I would argue that this happens when Théoden is actually talking to Saruman. So Saruman is still trying to undermine King Théoden's resolve, still trying to lure Théoden into an unholy peace, just like Freka was trying to do that same thing to Helm. And I will only read parts of this, but I love it. Théoden says, "We will have peace. Yes, we will have peace. We will have peace when you and your works have perished and the works of your dark master to whom you would deliver us. You are a liar, Saruman, and a corrupter of men's hearts. When you hang from the gibbet at your own window for the sport of your own crows, I will have peace with you in Ornithanc. So much for the house of Eorl, a lesser son of greater sires than mine. But I do not need to lick your fingers. Turn elsewhither. But I fear your voice has lost its charm. His voice was the staff, and it is broken." And although Théoden feels like he's the lesser son of greater sires, in this moment, he steps into the renown of his people. He steps into his northern courage. His victory here, as he leaves this scene, he is every bit the man that Helm Hammerhand was and more. Because where Helm Hammerhand reminds us of those pre-Beowulf heroic tales of people fighting a physical enemy, Théoden reminds us more of Beowulf, where his struggle is more mythic. His struggle is more spiritual, more psychological than Helm Hammerhand's was. And Théoden leaves this interaction ready to set a new bar for the kings that will come after him. And he's going to do so by riding to the aid of Gondor and fulfilling the Oath of Eorl. What is the Oath of Eorl? I'm glad you asked, as if you don't know. But the Oath of Eorl is made between Théoden's his namesake ancestor Eorl, and the Gondorian ruling steward Cirion. And it really results in the foundation of the land of Rohan. The oath is called the Oath of Eorl or the Oath of Cirion, but it is very much like an Old Testament covenant as defined by Dr. Sandra Richter. The most important part of this is that this oath is actually witnessed by Eru Ilúvatar and left in his keeping. This only happens a handful of times in Tolkien's entire legendarium, and we know that because Tolkien tells us himself. This is the divine witness of a covenant. The place where the oath actually takes place is called Helefrin. It means the holy mountain. We're definitely getting connections to Mount Sinai here. There is land exchange during this oath. That land will become the land of Rohan. There is an agreement to mutual aid, and there is fictive kinship language used. Eorl, being a young man at the time, is more like there's son imagery there. Cirion, being an older man, there's like a kind of father-son imagery going there, but that is an important part of a covenant. And although there is no sacrifice actually made during this oath, the oath is actually taking place over the grave of none other than Elendil, the priest king, who sacrificed himself fighting Sauron. This is a covenant. And like a biblical covenant, it has a genealogical component because Errol enters into this oath not only for himself, but for his descendants, of which Théoden is one. But when we talk about the Old Testament covenants, we're generally talking about either a parity treaty, a treaty between equals, or a suzerain vassal treaty, kind of a lord-serf thing. But I would say that the Oath of Errol is unique and it is neither one, actually. Although the Oath of Kirian and Errol is evocative of the ancient Near Eastern covenants, it is neither a parity nor a suzerain vassal treaty. Gondor clearly has preeminence, but not dominance. Rohan is the recipient of a great gift of land, but is not reduced to several dependents. The oath is one of sacred friendship between two unequal people with mutual affection and freedom, absent of oppression, acknowledging mutual dependence, and witnessed by the suzerain of the universe, the one who is above all thrones forever. And this sounds a whole lot like loving the Lord with all your heart and loving your neighbor as yourself, because this is an oath of sacred friendship. So when Théoden rides to the aid of Gondor, he is not just a nice guy doing a good thing. He is actually showing what your Bible calls covenantal faithfulness or faithful love. He is actually honoring Eru Iluvatar by coming to the aid of his neighbors. And he's going to give his life in service of God and his neighbors. Théoden has taken the northern courage of his people and he has translated it into the life of martyrdom, the holy life of a saint. He has made a very significant arc through the story. He's gone from being afraid and despairing and death avoidant to, at Helm's Deep, being willing to face death with dignity, like Helm Hammerhand, to now he is riding to meet death. He's not just in a bad place where he has to go out to meet death. He is riding out to meet death head on in service of God and service of his neighbor. I love this scene as Théoden is riding to his death. He says, Théoden could not be overtaken. Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins. He was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Aramne the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. This reminds me so much of Jesus and when he says that greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Because this is what Théoden has done. Théoden says, my body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall now not be ashamed. Théoden knows he's done good. He knows he's at least met the renown of Helm Hammerhand, but in reality, he's surpassed him. He has set a new standard for the kings that will follow him. To become the eucatastrophe, Théoden had to regain his northern courage. He had to regain his heroic spirit. He didn't stop at northern courage, but it was a stepping stone on his way to the good death. He was required to embrace really the good death of Elendil, the good death of self-sacrifice, of standing against evil no matter the cost. And what do you know? You and I have been invited into the death of a good king as well. Invited not to just avoid death, not to just face death bravely, but to actually embrace death, to take up our cross and follow our King. So, if we want to live the cruciform life, we have to know what it means to live a good life and to die a good death. The Rohirrim are amazing because they are really mortal men. They are not your serial longeval elves. They are not even your long-lived Dunedain. They are mortal men whose lives are short and whose death is always imminent. Death is inescapable, but it really matters how you meet it. It really matters. And what Tolkien is saying through King Théoden is life is not something that we hoard and we cherish and we pad with comfort. Life is something that we pour out and that we invest and we give to God and neighbor. And this is the good life. And this is the good death. It matters how we face death. So if we want to be the eucatastrophe to a world that's besieged by darkness, we have to live this cruciform life. We have to be like Jesus. We have to come to the aid of this world, no matter the cost. We have to stand against darkness, no matter what it costs us. We have to honor God by serving our neighbors. And then maybe we can be a reflection of that joy from beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. That's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's pause, take a moment, see if you have a question formulating in your mind. As you do that, the thing that stood out to me in a very slightly goofy way is just Tolkien's epic love of trees extended to family trees. Yes. And I hadn't picked up on like the leaves and branches are literal people. Yeah. And that's really lovely. Questions?
Yes.
I guess it's less a question than a thought. When you were talking about the family trees, and totally understand Bible studies going to die there, but well, Faramir and Éowyn, it's almost like going to what Joel talked about, recapitulation. It's almost like a recapitulation of the oath in some ways. And you see that with the genealogy. It's something as boring as a lesser marriage, because they're doing it kind of in the shade of Aragorn and Arwen.
Absolutely.
Their
whole marriage is an embodiment of the oath of Eorl and Cirion, because Faramir being descendant from Cirion and Éowyn being a descendant from Eorl, their marriage becomes a little package of that. And isn't marriage always a reflection of the commandment to love God and love our neighbor? Your neighbor's just really close to you and snores in your ear. So, I mean, that reads.
Yeah, the Uncle of Renown stuff, I just blew my mind, And so I think especially connecting it to even Helm Hammerhand's nephew himself living into that. And then, the movie kind of captures that pretty well, where he's wearing his armor. Yeah. But I wanted to know if there were any other instances where you saw that, and maybe what does it mean for the overall progression of the legendarium?
The Oath of Renown, or the Uncle of Renown?
Yeah.
So the Uncle of Renown is actually, it's one of those things that's once you see it, you just can't stop seeing it. So Brandabas Boror Tuk is one of the uncles of renown, but Hurin is actually an uncle of renown for the lineage of the half-elven. And when you look at the uncles of infamy, I sort of admit Turin is like a cousin of infamy. What you have with the lineage of the half-elven, though, is you have a graced family line, and you have eucatastrophe follows this family line. The line of Eärendil, the line of Beren and Luthien, of Tuor and Idril. And what you're going to find, though, is Tolkien's tragedies are placed ancillary to this lineage. All of your major Tolkienian tragedies are ancillary to this lineage, mostly. Even the tale of Adarian and Arendis, which is the tale of the bad marriage, it's placed alongside. It's the exact place where the line of Elros breaks into two. And on one side goes the lineage that will eventually lead to Aragorn, and on the other side is the lineage that leads to Ar-Pharazôn. But it's a bad marriage, a tragic marriage, that actually marks the beginning of the end there. So he really uses it in such a beautiful way. So what we see is that eucatastrophe and discatastrophe are not alien things. They're the same genre, and there's choices made, and there's, and they're closely related to each other. But you see people living into grace, and you see people falling into tragedy. Sorry, I'm a preacher by nature. I don't know if you can tell, but I could talk all day.
Okay, so this is just an extension to that from an online question. The dynamic of living up to one's uncle, how do you see that in the relationship between Bilbo and Frodo?
So that's really interesting. I mean, because Verlin Flieger actually talks about the relationship between Bilbo and Frodo in a really great essay on Frodo and Aragorn, actually. And that there is really something very medieval going around about the very special relationship that a hero has to their sister's son in particular. And although the lineage between those is a little squirrely because Frodo's not his literal nephew, but he is related to him through the female line. It's significant. That's not an accident. I think Tolkien did that super intentionally because it's very medieval and it's meaningful.
Can uncles of renown be adoptive?
Yeah, well, that's the great thing, is uncle of renown is a spiritual heritage. Théoden is not Helm Hammerhand is not the direct ancestor of Théoden. So the heritage of an uncle of renown is a spiritual heritage. So when we look at the saints of old, those are our uncles and aunts, I would say, aunts of renown. Yes?
Did you have that one? I had another one. So, first a thought, you're talking about uncles of infamy. Yeah. It occurred to me thinking here, that was his uncle who left his family destitute. His mom's sister's husband cut his mother off when she became Catholic. Right. And then it got me thinking about, everyone knows how sad he was at his mom's death. Shippey, I think, points out, his dad's death impacted him. And in particular, Gandalf, he takes Aragorn, Faramir, and Frodo under his wing. Do you think there's a tie between his own sense of loss from not having a dad, basically, and these uncles that you're talking about?
Oh man, I wouldn't pretend to get into the professor's head, but I wouldn't say it's out of line. I think Tolkien wrote with his entire person and his entire experience, and he would have. It's possible. I don't know. I actually really try to avoid the details of Tolkien's life. I try to just focus on what he wrote. But it's for certain possible because it resonates, and if it resonates, it means it's true, and that would have been the experience he pulled from. So.
Well done. That was wonderful. Just given Tolkien's love for his mother, and we talked about calling her a saint and martyrdom, and obviously his devotion to the Blessed Mother. Have you ever looked into maybe mother of renowns throughout the genealogy? Are there any?
It's definitely a potential. One of the purposes of my treatise is this is an example of what you can do by studying genealogy. I want to open up a whole field of study. I don't want to be the only person writing on Tolkien's genealogy, so I just think we need to be looking at it. So I think you could definitely do something like that because there are some really awesome women in his genealogies, and you can tell a little bit about Tolkien and his love for women actually by looking at his genealogies. For instance, the Númenórean kings, their connection, the kings of Gondor, their connection to the kings of Númenor is actually via a woman. It's Silmarillion, which is pretty profound, actually.
Okay, I'm going to show my total ignorance. But I'm wondering about what you're talking about in typology and archetypes, and how does that all come together?
It does. It certainly overlaps a good bit because genealogy was important to ancient people. very important to ancient people and went into typographies. For example, the sister sun is a medieval archetype. So yes, I was loving your lecture because it all ties in together. Absolutely.
These are great questions. Any more? Okay. Beautiful. Please, whatever you do, don't forget that in Tolkien, there's nothing hotter than distant relatives. Like that. I mean, well, some closer than others.